The pioneer our group is presenting is B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was a prominent American psychologist in the mid 20th century who researched and discovered the theory of operant conditioning. Burris Frederick Skinner was born on March the 20th, 1904, in the rural town of Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. Skinner had a small family with just one brother, William, who was 8 years younger than he was. His father, William Sr., worked for a law firm, and his mother, Mary, was a stay at home wife. His mother was a very accomplished pianist as well. Early in his life, Skinner developed a skeptic and inquisitive nature. Skinner's family was nominally Presbyterian, but they often skipped services, and by the age of 12, Skinner would describe himself as an atheist. B.F. Skinner fondly remembered his childhood in Susquehanna and remarked of his family life that it was warm and stable. Being raised in such a nurturing environment would no doubt contribute to his academic success and keen intellect. However, there was tragedy. His younger brother, Edward, died at the age of 16, and Skinner would actually later deduce that it was a cerebral hemorrhage that had killed his brother. In his playtime with his friends and his brother, Skinner would show his inquisitive nature and propensity to build things. Skinner helped to manage the family garden with his brother, and he explored the forests and trapped animals with his brother. On one occasion, he and one of his playmates would build a log cabin. Skinner was also a prolific reader, even in his early childhood, and his favorite book as a child was Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. In his middle childhood, Skinner began to show some of the interests that would shape his career in psychology. And at the age of 12, Skinner began to read Francis Bacon, and he soon subscribed to the theory of deductive reasoning of Francis Bacon's and Bacon's method of scientific research. Skinner also loved literature, especially Shakespeare and his tragedies, although he subscribed to the conspiracy theory that it was actually Francis Bacon who had written all of Shakespeare's works. This love for literature may have driven Skinner to pursue his Bachelor's of Art in English Literature at Hamilton College. And Skinner graduated from Susquehanna High School as second in his class in 1922. In the September of that year, he went to Hamilton College in New York, where he pursued a bachelor's in English literature. Skinner's dream at this point in his life was to become a novelist, and at Hamilton College, Skinner published his poetry in the Hamilton College newspaper. At Hamilton College, Skinner did not have many friends, and he was viewed as standoffish by most of the other students. Skinner graduated from Hamilton in 1926, and he moved back home and tried his hand at becoming a novelist during this time. He published only a few newspaper articles and ads for a ship from 1926 to 1927, and he began to refer to this period of his life as his dark year due to his lack of success in work. In mid 1927, Skinner moved to New York City, where he became a bookstore clerk. And while working in the bookstore, Skinner came across Ivan Pavlov's works and became interested in psychology. In 1928, Skinner enrolled at Harvard at the age of 24. And at Harvard, he enrolled in the psychology department and developed a holistic approach to his psychological studies. Skinner stressed studying what he termed the animal as a whole. It was during this time at Harvard that Skinner developed his famous Skinner box, through which he could observe rats and the behavior of other animals in a controlled environment, and he came to discover some of his most important concepts of operant conditioning theory. And in 1936, B.F. Skinner married to Yvonne Blue, and the couple moved to Minnesota. And Skinner and Yvonne had two daughters together, Julie and Deborah. Skinner's first job as a professor was at the University of Minnesota, where he worked from 1936 to 1945. And it was during this time at the University of Minnesota that Skinner published his first book, The Behavior of Organisms, in which he detailed his theory of operant conditioning and his hypothesis that activities were controlled by consequence, their consequence being either reward or punishment. In 1947, Skinner moved to Indiana University and worked for 2 years as the head of the psychology department. And from 1949 until his death in 1990, Skinner would work at Harvard as a tenured professor, where he would release most of his 21 books and 180 journal articles. During his time at Harvard, the material he would use in his first few years to teach later were used in his Science and Human Behavior, which was released in 1953.
The Skinner box. The Skinner box is a scientific contraption that Skinner used to observe the behavior of rats and other animals. The Skinner box is one of Skinner's claims to fame. Skinner could verifiably and consistently predict the behavior of rats. In the Skinner box experiments, he found that rats that were starved 24 hours all pressed the food release bar at the same rate. Skinner also built an air crib for his second daughter. The crib was heated and had a plexiglass window to observe the baby. The theory of operant conditioning. Positive reinforcement of a behavior was shown to produce a new behavior in rats and other animals that Skinner tested. This led him to his belief of operant conditioning. In his 1938 book, Behavior of Organisms, Skinner lays out his theory of operant conditioning and his findings on the behavior. Skinner's theory of operant conditioning and his many writings explaining it are one of his claims to fame. Skinner studied this most extensively at Harvard while on his fellowship in the 1930s. Notable publications. Skinner was a prolific writer in his lifetime and published 20 books and 200 articles. Walden 2, written in 1948, explores his theories of behaviorism in a fictional novel setting. It examines conditioning through rewards and how you would incentivize people to work in a utopian society. Skinner also extensively studied how schedules of reinforcement, primarily through reward, make behavior occur more frequently in his book Science and Behavior, written in 1953, and Schedules of Reinforcement, written in 1957. Career criticism. Criticism of Skinner. Skinner was often criticized for his view that the neurophysiological did not explain behavior. Skinner himself, however, never outright stated that neuroscience was not an important field. Skinner was criticized multiple times in different literary journals, most famously by Noam Chomsky. Skinner's criticism of others. Although inspired by Pavlov and Freud, Skinner mostly critiqued these two. Skinner often criticized those who he felt were not studying the neural process, but instead studying behavior. He often built upon their work and tested their theories for himself. Operant conditioning and the Skinner box are two of Skinner's most lasting contributions to educational psychology.
There were several educational psychologists that influenced Skinner. The three major influences of Skinner were John Watson, Ivan Pavlov, and Edward Thorndike. John Watson is considered the father of behaviorism. He famously wrote what's considered the Behaviorist Manifesto. He had more extreme views on environment's influence of behavior than Skinner. He claimed that all behavior is learned through interaction with the environment. Skinner didn't necessarily believe this was true, which is part of the reason he went on to develop his theory of operant conditioning. John Watson also pushed for psychology to be viewed as a real science. It hadn't been up to that point, and he wanted the world to view psychology as a real science. Ivan Pavlov first introduced conditioning as a concept and later developed his theory of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning and Ivan Pavlov's work with conditioning primarily focused on the physiological stimuli and the physiological responses that came with conditioning. Edward Lee Thorndike laid the groundwork for Skinner's operant conditioning theory by defining two laws of conditioning, the first being the law of exercise and the second being the law of effect. Thorndike's laws led Skinner to develop his theory of operant conditioning. In his later career, he became focused on philosophical and moral issues. He still felt his work was misunderstood, which is what led him to write about behaviorism. He remained active in his professional life, speaking at an event just 10 days before his death and publishing his last article on the day of his death. His published works from 1969 to 1990 are considered some of his most major contributions to the field. Contingencies of Reinforcement, he released in 1969. Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which is considered his most famous work, was written in 1971. About Behaviorism in 1974. And he also released a series of autobiographical volumes, Particulars of My Life, The Shaping of a Behaviorist, and A Matter of Consequences. In his later personal life, he underwent many struggles with his health, although he remained relatively healthy until the late 1980s. At the age of 67, he did begin having symptoms of angina, but he remained married to his wife until his death in 1990 and close with both of his daughters, who managed his diet and encouraged him to adopt a healthier lifestyle. During the 1970s, he had significant loss of his hearing. And then in the 1980s, he underwent 2 surgeries after doctors discovered a cancerous lesion in his head. In 1989, he was diagnosed with leukemia, which is what ultimately took his life. And on August 19th of 1990, he passed away from complications of leukemia. Skinner's influence on teaching is still very prevalent today. His theory of operant conditioning is still widely used in a number of ways in the classroom, such as classroom management, student performance, and skill shaping. His work provides educators with a framework for many things, such as punishing bad behavior and encouraging good behavior, developing interest and excitement for learning, and creating an environment where learning can thrive. Specific terms that we still use today widely are positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, neutral operants, reinforcers, and punishers. Thank you, and this has been our presentation on B.F. Skinner and operant conditioning.